The papers sat on the mahogany table like a death sentence dressed in legal language, and every single person in that room wanted Clara Davenport to sign them. Her lawyer, Gerald Marsh, had his pen extended toward her across the gleaming surface, his eyes telegraphing desperation so loudly she could practically hear it. Her uncle, Dorian Davenport, stood at the window with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that particular way that had always preceded bad things in her childhood. The two vampire emissaries flanking the door were perfectly still, perfectly white, perfectly beautiful, and perfectly terrifying. And at the far end of the room, seated in the carved chair that had somehow become his throne simply because he chose to sit in it, was Rafael Belisar, Duke of the Crimson Court, Lord of the Eastern Compact, the oldest living vampire in the Northern Hemisphere. According to the treaty documents she had read 17 times in the last 3 days, he was watching her with eyes the color of a winter sea, pale and deep and utterly unreadable, and his white hair fell across one shoulder like spilled moonlight. "Miss Davenport," Gerald said, his voice cracking at the edge, "the accord of succession cannot be held open indefinitely. The blood law requires a human signatory from the founding family. Your father would have wanted—" "Do not tell me what my father would have wanted," Clara said quietly. The room went very still. The two emissaries exchanged a glance so fast a human would have missed it entirely. Rafael Belisar had not moved so much as a finger, but somehow he felt closer, the way a thunderstorm feels closer even before the lightning comes. Clara picked up the papers. She ran her thumb along their edges, feeling the embossed seal of the Crimson Court, feeling the raised letterhead of Davenport Holdings, feeling the weight of everything her family had built across 4 generations and everything she stood to lose in the next 4 seconds. She thought about what was written on page 37. The clause she had found at 2 in the morning, hunched over her laptop with cold coffee and shaking hands. The clause that explained why every single person in this room wanted her to sign. She tore the papers in half. The sound was catastrophic in the silence. Gerald made a noise like a man who had just been struck. Dorian spun from the window so fast his elbow hit the glass. The emissaries stepped forward simultaneously, and for one blazing moment Clara thought she was going to be in very serious danger. Then Rafael Belisar rose from his chair. He was tall. She had known that, abstractly, from the moment he entered the building. But standing, moving, crossing the room with that particular vampire grace that made the air seem to rearrange itself around him, he was something else entirely. He stopped between Clara and the emissaries, his back to her, his presence filling the space like a physical wall. "Leave us," he said, 2 words. Quiet as stone dropping into deep water, the emissaries left. Gerald gathered what remained of his composure and his briefcase and followed. Dorian opened his mouth, looked at the back of Rafael Belisar's head, and apparently thought better of whatever he intended to say. The door closed. Clara stood alone with a vampire duke and 2 halves of a destroyed treaty, and she was not, she noted with some private surprise, afraid. She was furious. "You knew about page 37, she said. He turned to face her. Up close, his eyes was not cold at all. They were layered like ice over deep water, and there was something behind them that moved. "Yes," he said. "How long?" "Since the accord was drafted, that was 6 months ago." She set the torn halves down on the table. Her hands were steady. 6 months, and you let them bring me here, let them build this entire performance, and you never once. "I wanted to see what you would do," he said. The honesty of it was so disarming that she almost lost her thread entirely. She grabbed it back. "Page 37 would have transferred controlling interest in Davenport Holdings to the Crimson Court the moment I signed," she said. "Ed. Not a partnership, not an alliance. Total control. My family's company, everything my father built, handed over under the legal framework of a vampire blood law that would have made it irrevocable for a century." "Yes," Rafael said again. "And my uncle knew. Your uncle drafted the clause." She had suspected. Knowing was different. She breathed through it. "My uncle invited you here," she said, slowly, working through it. "He used the accord of succession as the vehicle because it legitimately required a Davenport signature, so I couldn't be bypassed. He planned to use your court's legal weight to make the transfer appear voluntary and binding, and you went along with it." "I attended," Rafael said. "I have not yet agreed to anything." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Whatever was moving behind those layered eyes was doing it more visibly now, something that looked almost like respect. "Why?" she asked. "Why come at all if you didn't intend to support the scheme?" "Because your uncle told me you were a grief-stricken, overwhelmed young woman who had inherited a company she didn't understand and who would be grateful for guidance." He paused. "I wanted to see if that was true." "And?" "It is spectacularly untrue," he said, and the corners of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Clara picked up one half of the torn papers. She looked at the embossed crimson court seal, the beautiful old-world typography, the 6 months of legal architecture built on a lie. "I need a lawyer," she said. "One who isn't on my uncle's payroll." "I can provide that," Rafael said. She looked up sharply. "Why would you do that?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that made her understand, viscerally, that he was choosing his next words from a much larger array of possible words, that she was receiving a curated version of something vast. "Because what your uncle attempted is a violation of the compact's own founding principles," he said. "Because I will not have the Crimson Court's name on a fraud, and because—" He stopped. "Because," she said, "because you tore the papers," he said, "and I find that I would very much like to know you better, Clara Davenport." She did not know what to do with that. She filed it away in the part of her brain that dealt with overwhelming information and returned to the immediate crisis. "My uncle controls the board," she said. "He has 3 of the 5 votes. If I challenge the attempted transfer, he'll move against me directly. He could have me removed as chair within 48 hours. Then we have 48 hours. Rafael said, as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world. She stared at him. "You're going to help me." "I am going to help you," he confirmed. "I tore up your treaty. You tore up a fraudulent document that bore my court's seal without my genuine consent. You did me a service." He moved toward the door, and she noticed again that quality of motion, that absolute physical certainty. "Come. We have work to do, and I suspect your uncle is already making calls." She grabbed her bag. She had not planned any of this. She had come in prepared to sign, or prepared to walk out alone. She had not accounted for a vampire duke with winter sea eyes who seemed, against all logic, to be on her side. She followed him anyway. She had always been better at moving forward than standing still. The Crimson Court's vehicle waiting outside was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for something theatrical, black glass, and ostentatious length. What arrived at the curb was a sleek, expensive, completely ordinary-looking car with a driver who inclined his head in that particular vampire way that was both courteous and slightly terrifying. Rafael held the door for her. She got in. "Where are we going?" she asked. "The Terrace," he said. "It is the Eastern Compact's licensed establishment in this city. Neutral ground, protected under blood law, and entirely outside your uncle's jurisdiction." "Blood law," she repeated. "You keep referencing it. Explain it to me properly." "If I'm going to be involved with the Crimson Court in any capacity, I need to understand the actual rules." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression shifted with what she was beginning to recognize as his version of being pleasantly surprised. "Most humans who deal with our courts prefer not to know the specifics," he said. "Most humans, I imagine, are not facing a hostile board takeover underpinned by vampire legal framework," she said. He nodded, once in acknowledgement. "Blood law," he said, "is the binding framework of all vampire governance. It is ancient, older than most human legal systems, and it is absolute within our world. When a compact, our version of a treaty, is signed, it is binding across generations, irrevocable unless released by mutual consent of all founding parties, or nullified by a demonstrated violation of its founding principles." He paused. "The accord of succession that your uncle orchestrated would have been signed under false pretenses, which constitutes a founding violation. That is the thread we will pull." "Can you prove the false pretenses?" "I can attest to them before the Compact Council as the primary vampire signatory," he said. "My word as a Duke of Standing carries the weight of testimony under blood law." She thought about that. "So you would testify against the document you came here to sign. I came here to assess. I never signed. And if you testify, what does that cost you, politically?" He was quiet for a moment. "Your uncle has allies in the Western Compact," he said. "The relationship between the Eastern and Western Compacts is not hostile, but it is not warm." My testimony would generate friction. You'd take that friction for a company you have no stake in and a woman you met an hour ago. I have a stake in the integrity of blood law, he said, and I met you longer than an hour ago. She frowned. We were introduced 45 minutes. I have known of you for 4 months, he said, since your uncle first approached my court. I have read everything publicly available about you. Your doctoral thesis on corporate governance frameworks, your restructuring of Davenport Holdings' charitable arm, the op-ed you wrote in the Financial Review about ethical succession planning. He paused again, and this time the pause felt different, more weighted. I found I had a great deal of respect for you before you ever walked into that room. Clara looked out the window. The city moved past, ordinary and glass-fronted and indifferent. She felt something she had not felt in a very long time, since before her father died, since before the grief and the weight and the isolation of suddenly being the last Davenport who cared, which was the sensation of being genuinely, accurately seen. You should probably know, she said, that I am not easy to work with when I'm being managed. I have no intention of managing you, Rafael said. Most people who say that are lying. I am 643 years old, he said. I have no patience left for lying about small things. She turned back to look at him. Only small things? The almost smile appeared again. The large ones occasionally still require it, he admitted. In the interest of politics, she laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, coming up unexpectedly through the tension. He looked at her as if the sound had done something to him he hadn't anticipated, something he was immediately cataloguing and storing with great care. The terrace turned out to be a rooftop establishment behind an unmarked door in a building that looked like a converted bank, which it was. The interior was all deep mahogany and leather and the particular kind of lighting that made everyone look like they were sitting inside a painting. There were perhaps 8 other people present, all of them very pale and very still in that characteristic way, and all of them acknowledged Raphael's arrival with inclined heads and carefully neutral expressions that nevertheless communicated volumes about his standing. He brought her to a table at the perimeter with a clear sight line to the entrance, and what she suspected was some additional significance in its positioning that she didn't yet have the vocabulary to read. Your uncle will have made contact with the Western Compact within the last 20 minutes, Raphael said, settling across from her. He will claim I am acting in bad faith. He will attempt to build a case that the accord is still valid because your tearing of the papers was an emotional reaction rather than an informed refusal. He would make that argument, Clara said grimly. He's been calling me emotional since I was 12 years old and pointed out that his financial forecasts didn't add up. How do you wish to proceed? She spread her hands flat on the table, a habit she had when she was thinking, grounding herself physically while her mind worked. I need the board minutes from the last 6 months. I need the communications between Dorian and the Western Compact. I need documentation of my father's original intentions for succession, and I need all of it in the next. She checked her watch. 42 hours. The board minutes I can access through my own sources, Raphael said. The communications between your uncle and the Western Compact are more complex, however. He paused. I have a contact within the Western Compact who has had reservations about your uncle's approach from the beginning. Who? A vampire named Seraphiel. She serves on the Western Compact's ethics board and has been monitoring the accord drafting process with increasing concern. She has not yet acted because she had no human counterpart willing to stand against it. But now she does. Now she does, he agreed, their eyes held across the table. In the warm light of the terrace, with the city invisible below them and the strange, quiet world of vampire politics humming around them, Clara felt the ground of the situation shift beneath her. This was no longer just a corporate battle. She was standing in the middle of something ancient and intricate, with a man who had been watching over her from a distance for 4 months deciding, in this moment, to step into the open. Rafael, she said, using his name for the first time. Something about it made him very still. Why did you really come today? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer because I could not continue to observe from a distance the dismantling of everything your father built, he said at last. And because I was curious whether you were as formidable as your reputation suggested. A pause. And perhaps because I am tired after 600 years of standing on the periphery of things that matter. She held that for a moment, turning it over carefully. Does this matter to you? She asked, specifically. Not the blood law, not court politics. This, yes, he said. Very quiet, very certain. Something warm moved through her chest, underneath the fear and the anger and the exhaustion. She had not planned for this either. She was learning, rapidly, that Rafael Belisar consistently refused to fit inside that plan she made for him. All right, she said. Then let's work. They worked through the night. The terrace provided them with space and privacy, and a remarkable degree of logistical support that Clara gradually understood was the Eastern Compact operating at Rafael's quiet direction. By midnight, she had secure access to 3 years of Davenport Holdings Board, minutes through channels she chose not to examine too closely. By 2 in the morning, Seraphil had made contact via an encrypted line, her voice low and rapid and her vampire precision evident in the way she catalogued every relevant document she had gathered over the previous 4 months. Seraphil turned out to be compact and fierce, and somewhere between 300 and 400 years old, with a dry wit and a deep and personal offense at Dorian Davenport's attempted manipulation. Blood law exists to protect the integrity of agreements between our peoples, she said, her accent a layered thing that moved between several European origins, not to be used as a trapdoor under an heiress's feet. I have been waiting for someone to pull this thread. Thank you for waiting, Clara said. Thank your Duke, Seraphil replied. He contacted me 3 months ago and asked me to document everything. He told me there would be a moment. Clara looked across the table at Rafael. He was reviewing documents on his own screen, but she had the distinct impression he could hear every word perfectly well. He told you there would be a moment, she repeated. He said, and I quote precisely because I found it memorable, that when the heiress saw what was in those papers, she would not sign. Seraphil's voice carried a hint of warmth through its efficiency. He was quite certain of it, based on an op-ed, Clara said. Apparently so. She stared at the top of Raphael's white-headed head. He looked up and met her eyes. You prepared for this, she said, months ago. I prepared for the possibility, he said. I did not know for certain until you walked into that room. What changed when I walked in? He held her gaze. Everything, he said simply, and went back to his documents. She sat with that word for longer than she should have. Given the urgency of the situation, by 4 in the morning they had built a case that would make Dorian Davenport's position on the board legally untenable within any framework, human or vampire. The communications between Dorian and the Western Compact contact, a vampire named Veltharion, who turned out to have a history of exactly this type of arrangement, were damning in their clarity. Dorian had explicitly negotiated the clause on page 37 without Clara's knowledge or consent, had represented to the Crimson Court that Clara was aware of and amenable to the full terms, and had arranged for her isolation from independent legal counsel in the weeks preceding the signing meeting. This is fraud, Clara said, looking at the documented chain. Plain fraud, not just blood law violation. Human law fraud, yes, Rafael said, which gives you 2 parallel avenues of challenge. He'll fight it. He will. But he will be fighting on 2 fronts with documented evidence against him on both. Rafael straightened, rolling his shoulders slightly, the first physical sign of tiredness she had seen from him. We should rest for a few hours. The Compact Council's emergency session begins at 10, and you will need to be present and at your sharpest. I'll be fine, she said automatically. Clara. Her name in his voice had a quality she was already, dangerously, coming to rely on. Solid, considered, as if saying it meant something to him. You have been operating at maximum intensity for 8 hours, following an enormous emotional confrontation. Rest is not weakness, it is preparation. She started to argue, caught herself, and realized she was doing it because being told what to do by anyone had become a reflex resistance. She thought about whether he was wrong. He was not wrong. Is there somewhere to sleep here? She asked. The terrace maintains guest quarters, he said. Secure ones. You'll still be here when I wake up. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. I will be here, he said. She slept 4 hours in a room that smelled of cedar and cold air and woke to a message from her uncle on her personal phone containing 6 different legal threats, which she read, photographed for documentation, and forwarded to Seraphil before she had fully finished her first cup of the dark coffee that had appeared on the small table by the window. Rafael was in the main room, standing at the window in the grey early light, and she noticed again how he existed in spaces, how he made them feel anchored. He had changed into fresh clothes at some point, which meant the terrace maintained a wardrobe for him, which meant this was not his first extended stay here, which meant the Eastern Compact had been operating in this city with a more permanent presence than was publicly acknowledged. She filed that away too. He sent threats, she said. 6 of them. Seraphil contacted me 20 minutes ago, he said without turning. Veltharion has already begun distancing himself from your uncle. The Western Compact does not want this case proceeding if it exposes Veltharion's methodology. So they'll sacrifice Dorian. They'll withdraw support, which leaves him exposed on the blood law side. He still has his human legal resources, but without vampire court backing, the accord itself collapses. She came to stand beside him at the window. The city was doing its ordinary morning things, indifferent as ever, all glass and motion and human noise. My father knew about the vampires, she said. It wasn't a question, she had figured it out somewhere in the 4 hours of sleep. The original Davenport compact with the Eastern Court. Your grandfather established it, Rafael said. Your father renewed it. They were both men of unusual good faith. A pause. Your father in particular was someone I respected. You knew him. We met 4 times over 15 years, he said. He was the one who told me about you, long before you became the public figure you are. He spoke of you with extraordinary pride. She looked at him. Her throat was doing something complicated. He never mentioned you, she said. He knew I would introduce myself when the time was right, Rafael said. He finally turned from the window to face her. In the grey morning light, his eyes were a different shade of that winter sea colour, softer and more complex. I regret that the circumstances were not better. They were what they were, she said, her father's phrase, his particular pragmatic warmth, and saying it made her miss him with a sharpness that was still sometimes ambush-vivid even 2 years on. He would have appreciated what you're doing. I am doing what is right, Rafael said. Your father always told me that was the primary obligation of anyone with power. She wanted very badly to touch his hand. She did not touch his hand. She took a breath instead and turned back toward the room. The Compact Council session, she said. He moved away from the window, and the moment between them stretched and held, and eventually carefully settled into something she recognized as the beginning of something important. He explained the council's structure with the same precision and patience he had applied to everything else, and she listened with the same thorough attention she applied to everything else. And by the time they left for the council session, she understood that they worked together with a naturalness that she had never, in 32 years of professional and personal life, experienced with anyone. The Compact Council met in a building that looked like a private bank from the outside, which it was also, and like an old European court chamber from the inside, which it also essentially was. The ceiling was 3 stories above them, covered in dark painting and gilt that had the quality of genuine age. The 12 council members were arranged in a curved formation, all of them pale and still and radiating that compound sensation of beauty and danger that Clara was slowly, painstakingly, learning to metabolize without visible reaction. Dorian Davenport was already there. He looked at her across the chamber with an expression that had layers. The outermost layer was contempt. The layer beneath that was something more complicated and more painful. The look of someone who had made a choice and was discovering that it was going to cost more than expected. Clara met his eyes directly and said nothing. The council's presiding member, an ancient vampire named Veilthos, whose white hair was long enough to be braided and whose air of authority made even Raphael seem briefly relative, opened the session in a voice like a cello being played in a cathedral. We are convened on an emergency basis regarding the accord of succession under the Davenport Crimson Court Compact framework, Veilthos said. Allegations of foundational fraud have been raised. Under blood law, any party with documentary standing may present. Duke Belisar, you requested this session. Proceed. Raphael presented with the economy and precision of someone who had done this many times over many centuries, but the content beneath the economy was devastating. He laid out the documented evidence, Seraphiel's testimony, delivered via secure connection, the communications between Dorian and Veltharion, the clause on page 37, the representation made to the Crimson Court that Clara Davenport was informed and consenting. When Rafael finished, Velthos turned to Dorian's lawyer, a very pale human, who looked as though he had been working for the vampire court for long enough to have absorbed their mannerisms, spoke carefully and at length. His argument was, essentially, that Clara had always had access to the documents, that no explicit misrepresentation had been made because Clara had been given copies of everything, and that her failure to read page 37 carefully was her own responsibility. Clara stood up. "May a human party address the council directly?" she asked, speaking to Velthos. A silence, the kind of silence that has a texture. "Blood law permits it," Velthos said. "You may speak, Miss Davenport." She laid out her own evidence with the same calm precision she had applied to corporate board meetings since she was 27 years old. The communications she had documented through her own research. The timeline of her access to independent legal counsel, systematically blocked by her uncle's management of her father's estate. The specific representations made to her about the nature of the accord before she entered the signing room. She had been told it was a standard renewal of the existing compact, not a transfer of controlling interest, not a fundamental restructuring of the Davenport Crimson Court relationship. "I did not fail to read page 37 carefully," she said. "I read it at 2 a.m. on my third full pass through the documents. After I finally located an unredacted version. The version provided to me initially omitted that page entirely." She placed the 2 versions of the document on the council table. "This is the version provided to me. This is the full version. You can count." The council looked. The silence was different this time. Velthos's ancient eyes moved from the documents to Dorian, to Clara, and finally to Rafael, and in their depths was a calculation so complex and so rapid that Clara got only the impression of enormous machinery moving. "Duke Belisar," Velthos said, "you attest that you were not informed that the human signatory had been provided an incomplete document." "I attest that I was told Miss Davenport had reviewed and was prepared to sign the complete accord," Rafael said. "I attest that this was a material misrepresentation, and that had I known the full circumstances, I would not have attended the signing ceremony." Velthos turned back to Dorian. Dorian's lawyer opened his mouth. Dorian stopped him with one raised hand. For a moment Clara thought her uncle was going to try to brazen it through. She could see him calculating, could read him with the terrible fluency of someone who had watched him operate all her life. Then something went out of him. She watched it happen, the particular deflation of a man who has looked at the numbers and found them final. "The Western Compact withdraws any association with the accord as drafted," Dorian said. His voice was flat. "I accept the Council's jurisdiction." Veltharion had apparently moved faster than even Rafael had anticipated, which told Clara something about what the Western Compact considered worth protecting. Velthos deliberated with his counsel for 4 minutes, which in vampire time she had learned to understand was the equivalent of a much longer human deliberation, simply compressed by the absence of the need for verbal processing. The Accord of Succession as drafted is nullified under blood law, founding principle violation, documented misrepresentation to a signatory party, Velthos announced. The existing compact between the Davenport family and the Eastern Compact, the original framework established by the senior Davenport, remains in full effect. Miss Davenport's position as the legitimate human counterparty to that compact is confirmed. Dorian Davenport's actions constitute a violation of the compact's good faith provisions and result in the forfeiture of his associated rights thereunder. She had won. The realization moved through her body slowly, like warm water, because she had been running so hard on adrenaline and caffeine and controlled fear for the last 20 hours that genuine relief was almost unfamiliar. She looked at Rafael. He was already looking at her. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The aftermath was procedural and exhausting, and she moved through it with steady competence, shaking hands, acknowledging Seraphiel's formal appearance in the chamber with genuine warmth, watching Dorian leave with the particular witnessed quality of someone seeing a long chapter close. The question of the board was separate: human law, human courts, and she spent 2 hours on the phone with 3 different lawyers, and came out of it with a timeline she could manage and an action plan that felt solid under her feet. When she finally found Rafael again, he was standing in the corridor outside the chamber, apparently doing nothing, but she understood by now that he did not actually do nothing. He was giving a space while remaining available. "It's not over," she said. "The board will take weeks. Dorian will challenge the forfeiture in human court." "Yes," he said, "but the blood law piece is done." "Irrevocably," he said. "The council's ruling cannot be appealed or reversed. Vaelthos has 500 years of procedural authority behind him." She leaned against the wall of the corridor and let out a breath she had been holding since, she thought, approximately the moment she arrived at that signing room yesterday. "I need a real lawyer," she said. "One who isn't compromised." "I know 3, he said. "Human vampire interfacing specialists, all of excellent standing." "Of course you do. I have been in this world for some time." She looked at him. The corridor was quiet, the chamber sounds muffled behind them, the particular silence of a space that occupied both worlds. "What happens now?" she asked. "Between the Crimson Court and Davenport Holdings. The original compact is intact, but the circumstances are entirely different from what your court was expecting." "The original compact is a trade and protection agreement," he said. "The Eastern Compact provides certain legal and logistical protections for Davenport Holdings' international operations, particularly in regions where vampire court jurisdictions overlaps with human commercial law. In exchange, the Davenport family has historically provided certain property rights and the weight of their human legal standing in matters that benefit both parties." "My father's compact," she said, "renewed twice in good faith. I would propose renewing it again in its original form if you are amenable. There is no hidden page 37 in the original." She almost smiled. "I'll have my lawyers review it this time." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and there it was again, that quality of genuine approval. She pushed off from the wall, her feet hurt. She had been in professional shoes for 19 hours. "Buy me dinner," she said, surprising herself. "A real one, not a working session." He looked at her with both of those layered eyes very present. "Yes," he said. They found a restaurant 3 blocks from the terrace that was blessedly ordinary, small tables and good wine, and food that was actual food rather than a statement. And they sat across from each other with all of the papers and the council and the blood law temporarily outside the door. She asked him about the 643 years. She had never been able to resist asking the important question directly, which was a quality her father had called her best and worst attribute in equal measure. He answered with a thoughtfulness she had not expected, which she then corrected in herself, because she kept expecting things of him based on categories he did not fit. He described time the way she imagined someone who had experienced a very great deal of it would, not as a long line stretching backward, but as a density, everything pressing forward all at once when you thought about it from the outside. "Does it feel lonely?" she asked, because she was thinking about her father and about absence and about the weight of being the last person who remembered something. "It has," he said. "There are periods in those centuries I would rather not revisit." He turned his wineglass slowly in one long-fingered hand. "More recently, less so. More recently, since when?" "Since I began reading a doctoral thesis on corporate governance frameworks at 3 in the morning, because I could not stop thinking about the woman who wrote it," he said, with the particular directness of someone who has had enough centuries to dispense with strategic indirection about things that matter. She felt the color come to her face. She was not a person who blushed easily. "That is either the most flattering thing anyone has ever said to me, or the most unnerving," she said. "Possibly both," he agreed. 600 years of perspective, and you spent several months reading my thesis, and your op-eds, and the quarterly reports for Davenport Holdings, which are unusually readable for documents of their type. I wrote those too," she said. "I know," he said. "Your father mentioned your insistence on writing them yourself." There was a warm weight to that, to the idea of her father mentioning her to this man across some private conversation she would never hear, with the particular pride her father had always expressed in her when he didn't know she was listening. "Tell me what he said," she said, "if you're willing." Rafael looked at her across the small table, and the restaurant sounds were soft around them, and he told her. Not what her father had said exactly, but the shape of it, the pride and the love, and the particular parental confidence in a child who had always known what she believed and acted on it. She did not cry. She had cried for her father in private and in specific, and she had learned the geography of her grief well enough to walk through it without losing her footing in company. But she felt it bright and clean underneath everything else. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for letting me tell you," he said. They were quiet together for a moment that had no anxiety in it, which was rare enough in her experience that she noticed it consciously. The following weeks were complicated in all the ways she had anticipated, and several she had not. The board challenge played out across 6 difficult days of procedural maneuvering, and she won it by 1 vote on the strength of documentation that Dorian had apparently believed was secured. The legal proceedings against her uncle moved into their proper channels, slow and certain as most serious things. Seraphiel became an unexpected ally in the navigation of the vampire court's political response to the situation, calling twice a week with the kind of crisp, informed updates that Clara recognized as the professional language of genuine partnership, and Rafael was present, not in a way that crowded her, not in a way that managed or directed. He was present in the way he had been since that first night, reliable and particular, available when she needed resources or information, or a specific quality of steady company that she could no longer pretend to herself was purely professional. He drove her home one evening after a meeting that had run 3 hours past its intended close, and she was silent in the car because she was too tired for conversation, and he seemed to understand that silence from her was not distance, it was rest. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said when they reached her building. "Doing what?" he asked. "Being here. The case is essentially closed. The compact renewal is with the lawyers. You could go back to wherever the Crimson Court's main seat is." "Veltharis Hall," he said. "In Salzburg. You could go back to Veltharis Hall." He looked at her in the way that had become, over the weeks, increasingly difficult to be on the receiving end of without wanting to move toward him. "Would you like me to?" he asked. She held the question. "No," she said. "Then I will remain," he said, uncomplicated. Final? As if the decision had been made long before she confirmed it. "Why?" she asked, the important question again. "Because I have been periphery to things that matter for too long," he said, "and I would like very much to stop." She got out of the car, then she turned back. "Come upstairs," she said. "I have a terrible coffee machine, but I'll make it work." The particular warmth that transformed his face, careful and significant, was something she was going to spend a long time understanding. He came upstairs. The coffee was, as advertised, terrible. They sat in her kitchen, which was small and practical and full of books and the particular evidence of a person who lived competently alone and had made peace with that. And they talked until 2 in the morning about things that had nothing to do with blood law or corporate governance, about history from a first-person perspective that constantly made her stop him and ask him to go back and tell her more, about her father, about her plans for the holdings, about a novel she had loved at 19 that turned out to have been published within his living memory. When he finally left, he paused in the doorway. "May I see you this weekend?" he asked, with the formality of someone who had spent enough centuries to know that direct questions were better than indirect ones. "Yes," she said. Over the following months, the shape of it became clear. The way the shape of important things becomes clear gradually, and then all at once. He learned the geography of her life with the particular attentive patience of someone for whom time was not a limiting factor, but for whom she specifically was. She learned the geography of his, the quiet ancient rhythms of a being who had outlived countless versions of the world and carried them all with him, the extraordinary private quality of his stillness that was not absence but depth. She met Seraphiel in person, finally, at the Eastern Compact's autumn gathering, and they got along with the startling ease of people who have been solving the same problems from different angles, and are relieved to finally be in the same room. She met Vailthos again under much better circumstances and found him, outside the formality of court, to have a dry and devastating wit and a detailed knowledge of human history that made conversation with him feel like standing in a library where everything was alive. She met Veltharis Hall in Salzburg in November. When Raphael finally extended the invitation with the careful gravity he brought to everything that mattered to him, it was a castle, genuinely, not the theatrical kind, not the decorative kind, but a working ancient building that had been quietly modernized within, without altering the weight of what it was from the outside. She stood in the courtyard in the cold November air and looked up at its height and thought about how many events had transpired within those walls over centuries. And then she went inside to find Raphael waiting in the entrance hall, with the same expression he always had when he saw her arrive somewhere, that contained significant thing that she had long since stopped pretending she did not understand. "It's extraordinary," she said. "It is old," he said, as if this were the more relevant property. Both. He showed her through rooms that contained centuries carefully, art and objects that were historical records as much as aesthetic choices, a library that made her stop in the doorway and just breathe for a moment at the scale of it. "You may stay as long as you like in here," he said. "I will find something to occupy me." "You say that as if you expect me to disappear in here for days." "Your father warned me," he said. She turned to look at him, startled. "My father warned you about my relationship to libraries." "He said you were a woman who would always choose knowledge when it was available," Raphael said. He said it as the highest possible compliment. She stood in the doorway of his library, in his ancient castle, in the cold city of his centuries, and understood that everything that had happened, since a torn page in a wood-paneled conference room, had brought her here, as naturally and as inevitably as rivers find the sea. She crossed the room and kissed him. He was very still for exactly 1 second, the stillness of a man for whom 600 years of careful emotional management have just become irrelevant. And then he kissed her back with a thoroughness and a tenderness that had all of that age and all of that depth behind it, and his hands were in her hair with the careful strength of someone who has wanted this specifically and has been waiting for her to be certain. When they finally drew back, he was looking at her with an expression she had never quite seen from him before, open in a way that made the layered complexity of his eyes resolve into something entirely simple. "Clara," he said, just her name, everything in it. "Yes," she said, answering the question he had not quite asked. That winter she moved between London and Salzburg with the practical flexibility of someone whose professional life had long since become locational independent, and whose personal life had become something she had not anticipated but was not. For a single moment, inclined to resist, the Davenport Holdings Board stabilized under the restructured governance framework she had spent 3 months implementing. An architecture that her father would have recognized and approved, and probably made a few pointed suggestions about, which she had the strange, comforting habit of working through herself in the voice she imagined for him. Dorian's case moved through the courts with the grinding certainty of documented fraud. She did not take pleasure in it, but she did not look away from it either. She extended the compact with the Eastern Court formally in February, signing the documents this time with 3 lawyers present, all of them independent and all of them briefed on the full history, in front of Vaelthos and Seraphiel and Raphael, who stood to one side and watched her sign with an expression that she recognized as the vampire equivalent of profound satisfaction. "Happy?" she asked him afterward, when the formal business was done. "With the compact renewal, or with you specifically?" he said. "Either." "Both, incalculably," he said, which was, she had learned, his version of effusive, Seraphiel, passing them in the corridor outside the council chamber, muttered something in what Clara had identified as 15th century Flemish that she suspected was complimentary based on the context. The spring was good. The spring was genuinely, uncomplicated good. A quality of time she had not had access to in several years, and she inhabited it with the conscious appreciation of someone who has learned that good seasons require attention. They walked in the grounds of Veltharis Hall in the late April evenings, after the sun had set enough to be safe for him in the open, and she learned the gardens, which he had been adding to across several centuries, and which were therefore a kind of autobiography in landscape, each section corresponding to a period of his history, some of them beautiful, and some of them deliberately spare in ways she came to understand, spoke to loss. "This section," she said, stopping in a cleared space where a single old stone bench sat in the center of what had been, and would perhaps again be, a planted area. "What happened here?" He was quiet for a moment. Someone I cared for, a human woman, a friend, in the 16th century. She died of a fever in late winter. I let the garden she planted go afterward. I have never replanted it. Clara looked at the space, the stone bench, the sky above it, deep blue going to dark. What was her name, she asked. Ilara, he said. She was a scholar. Stubborn and extremely opinionated and completely fearless in conversation. He paused. She would have found you exceptional. Clara sat on the stone bench. He sat beside her. Tell me about her, she said. He told her. She listened. The sky completed its transition to full dark, and the first stars came through, and she listened to 600 years of accumulated love and loss, with the complete attention that she had always given to important things, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands. His was very pale against hers. He turned it over, studying this, and then he looked at her with that open expression, the one where the complexity resolved. You are not afraid of what I am, he said. It was a statement, but it had the quality of a question. No, she said. Most people. I am not most people, she said. You established that quite thoroughly on the first day. You are exceptional, he said, with such directness that it bypassed her defenses entirely. She leaned against him. He was cool, slightly, in the way that was simply part of what he was, and she had long since stopped registering it as anything other than him. He curved an arm around her with the particular, careful strength that she associated with how he held everything important, as if aware always of his own power and choosing, with every motion, to use none of it on her. Rafael, she said, do you want me to stay? Not visiting, stay. He went very still. The question is whether you want to, he said carefully. I asked first, she said. Yes, he said, the single syllable with all the weight of centuries behind it. I have wanted that since approximately the moment you tore those papers. You have terrible timing, she said. That was in a very stressful meeting. I am aware. You watched a woman destroy several months of legal framework and thought, yes, I would like this person to live with me. I thought, he said, that I had never in 600 years seen someone so clearly. She lifted her head from his shoulder to look at him. I'll stay, she said. The expression on his face was the answer to a question she hadn't known, she had been asking for a long time. They sat in Ilara's garden for a while longer, and then they went inside, and the castle around them was vast and ancient and full of centuries, and she was no longer a woman standing at woman's things, but a woman who had walked through the door. She told Seraphiel in late May over the secure line. Keeping it professional and then watching Seraphiel fail to be professional about it in the specific way that a vampire trying to contain warm emotion while also maintaining 6 centuries of dignity tends to fail at it. I am pleased, Seraphiel said very crisply. Extremely pleased. I am going to tell Velthos. Please don't make it an announcement, Clara said. It is not an announcement. It is relevant information for the court's diplomatic register regarding the compact. That is absolutely an announcement. Goodbye, Clara. Velthos sent a written note. Ancient paper, actual ink, the kind of care that communicated respect across the formal vocabulary of vampire culture. She kept it on the windowsill in the library, the particular southeast-facing window, where the afternoon light came through just so. The summer was long and full. She ran Davenport Holdings from Veltharis Hall's modernized eastern wing with the same competence she had brought to everything. Video calls and quarterly reports, and the particular satisfaction of a company pointing in a direction she had chosen, rather than one chosen for her. The restructured board worked well. The new governance framework worked better. Her father's legacy was intact, was growing, was alive. She wrote another op-ed, this one about the legal frameworks governing human vampire commercial agreements, careful and informative and deliberately positioned to be useful to other human parties navigating the same territory she had navigated. Seraphiel called after it was published to say it was being discussed in Eastern Compact legal circles with considerable interest. Good, Clara said. You are building something, Seraphiel said, with the thoughtful quality she had when she was observing something larger than the immediate. I know, Clara said. Rafael read it the same evening it was published. She found him in the library with his screen, very still in that way that meant absorbed attention. You said nothing about the blood law mechanisms, he said. I addressed them in the footnotes, she said. The footnotes are remarkably thorough for footnotes. I put all the important things in the footnotes. He looked up at her with that direct, warm gaze. It is genuinely excellent, he said. Thank you, she said. I know. He put the screen down. She settled into the chair across from him, and outside the library windows the Austrian summer evening was doing its long, slow, golden thing, and the room smelled of old books and the particular cedar and cold air quality she would always associate with him. I have been thinking, he said. About what? About the long view, he said. You are aware that the compact, as a human court relationship, has provisions regarding the continuity of the human signatory party. She looked at him steadily. Yes. Your father renewed it twice. His father established it. The compact was designed with the expectation of a generational relationship. Yes, she said again. As the compact's current human counterparty, the question of the relationship's future continuity is one that will arise eventually, he said, with the very particular care of someone navigating territory they feel strongly about and are determined not to handle clumsily. Rafael, she said. He stopped. Are you trying to have a conversation about our future wrapped entirely in compact language? She asked. A pause. Yes, he admitted. Then say it directly, she said. You're 600 years old and you kissed me in your own library. You can say it directly. He was quiet for one moment. Then, with the absolute simplicity that characterized everything he did when he stopped managing it, I love you, he said. I would like to spend whatever time is available to us together. I am aware that the question of time, between what I am and what you are, is not simple. I am aware that I am asking you to consider things that have no easy answer, and I want you to know that I am not asking you to decide anything tonight or at any specific time, but I want you to know the truth of what I feel, so that you can make all your choices with complete information. The library was very quiet. The compact language was better, she said. He looked at her sharply. She was smiling. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Whatever time is available to us is what I want too, all of it, however long it is. She moved from her chair to sit beside him, close, and I love you too. I have for quite a while. I was waiting for the compact negotiation to end before I said it, because it seemed professionally inappropriate. He made a sound that was, she recognized with delight, very close to actual laughter. Professionally inappropriate, he said. We had active legal proceedings, she said. You are extraordinary, he said, and pulled her close with that careful strength, and she leaned into it, into him, into the reality of it. There was more to navigate, she knew that. The question of time and what it meant for two people made of such different stuff was real, and she was not a woman who refused to look at real things. But she also was not a woman who abandoned good choices because they were complicated, and this was the least ambiguous good choice she had made in a long time. The question of the compact's long continuity would resolve itself of the way that practical things resolve themselves, through conversation and legal architecture, and the particular human vampire interfacing expertise that she was. She realized with some amusement, now qualified to provide. They talked about it honestly over the following months, with the directness she had always required from everything important. The vampire world had mechanisms she had not known to ask about. Ancient choices, made rarely and with great weight, that were not simple and not romantic in the transactional sense, but were deeply significant in the way that all permanent things are significant. She would not be rushed into anything. He would not rush her. They had agreed on that with the completeness of two people who understood each other's requirements. What she had now was this: the library, the garden, the winter sea eyes looking at her from across rooms with something that had never in 600 years diminished its quality of being carefully chosen. The compact, renewed and solid and oriented correctly this time. The company, her father's and now hers, pointed forward. Seraphiel calling twice a week with characteristic crispness. Veilthos sending occasional written notes on beautiful paper, and the torn papers which she had, on some impulse she did not entirely examine, framed. They hung in the Eastern Wing's study, two halves of a document that had been intended to take everything from her, and what she saw when she looked at them was not the fraud or the fear of that morning, but the moment immediately after, the room going quiet, the winter sea eyes finding her across the silence, and the beginning of the most unexpected and complete thing that had ever happened to her. One evening in late autumn, standing in the entrance hall of Veltharis Hall with the Austrian cold pressing against the ancient windows and the warm interior light doing its particular amber work on the stone walls, Raphael came to find her from whatever he had been doing in the upper library, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment before crossing the room. He stood before her, and he put his hands on either side of her face, with a care that was the distillation of everything she knew about him. The power held still, the certainty offered gently. "Are you well?" he asked. It was what he always asked, and it always meant exactly what it said, simple and complete. "Very," she said. And she was. The castle settled around them. Old stones holding their centuries with the patience of things that have learned time is not an enemy. The compact was signed and solid. The board was stable and forward-facing. Her father's work was alive and growing. Seraphiel was, at this moment, probably correcting someone's procedural error in the Western Compact with precisely devastating efficiency. And she was here, in this place, with this person who had seen her clearly across 4 months of distance, and had come to a signing room prepared to watch her make the right choice, and who had been, since that morning, exactly what he promised in the most important way, present. She rose on her toes and kissed him, in the entrance hall of his 600-year-old castle, in the ordinary, extraordinary evening of her particular and permanent life. Outside the windows, the first snow of the year was beginning to fall, quiet and thorough and committed, covering the gardens and the old stones and the stone bench in Ilara's garden in white, and the world was cold and ancient and entirely, completely alive. She had torn the papers, she would tear them again. Everything after was hers.